Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, Kushalmehra. All right. Today's podcast is titled Hinduism from a British Lens. And to discuss Hinduism and the British lens, after a gap of 2.5 years, if I'm correct, or maybe 2 years, I don't keep track, Drishti is back on the podcast. So, Drishti, thanks for coming again.
Namaste, everyone. It's great to be back. So thank you for having me.
So, Drishti, in case people don't know about you and they've not seen you or seen the previous discussion on the podcast, so how about this? We start like this. Why don't you tell everybody a bit about yourself?
Sure. So namaste, everyone. So my name is Drishti. I featured on the Geographic podcast 2 years ago because of my history. So about 10 years ago, I made the decision to leave Islam, and along the way, I discovered and fell in love with Hindu Dharma. And that's really been, I guess, a really life-defining experience for me. From that, I went on to get involved with an organization called NHSF, so the National Hindu Students Forum in the UK. I was with them for 10 years, and I had the good fortune of being the national president for about 4 years. And now I work in M&A integration by day, and I also work with the Hindu American Foundation outside of work as well. So that's me.
Awesome. Drishti, so, all right, so we had a very interesting discussion the first time. It was actually one of the most popular podcasts, at least for me. A lot of... So usually, I gauge the popularity of the podcast not just from the views. I also gauge the popularity of a podcast from the amount of emails I get, personal emails about the podcast. So the highest amount of emails I've gotten was when I spoke with you. So let's start with this, right? What has been your experience? Because we're talking on the podcast now after a gap of a good 2+ years. So how has your journey as a Hindu been in that gap from, let's say, 2019, 18, 19 to say 21 now? How has your understanding of Hinduism changed, or have you changed as a Hindu? How has the journey been?
Sure. And it's a brilliant question to start off with, because I think the right answer, or the summation that I can give, is that as it was in my first 8 years and as it has been in the last 2 years, it's a constant evolution. I don't think when you are defining yourself as a Hindu or embracing Hindu Dharma, you come to this point where you say, aha, I've arrived. Now I'm it. Now I'm perfect. It's a constant evolution. So for me, it's been continuous work in terms of like my spiritual sadhana, my understanding, how I articulate Hindu Dharma, but also what's relevant. Where are some ideas that I've been holding on to that I have to let go of? Where are there opportunities for me to express how I'm Hindu more and, in a better way, but also relate to others, because we have an opportunity, I think, to take Hindu Dharma from being something that belongs to just a certain set of people, and by that I mean brown, Indian, those who have ancestors in India, and really start to expand what it means to be Hindu from a principle and practice perspective. So this notion of sustainability has been really big for me in the last 18 months or so, whereby can we articulate Dharma in a way that makes sense for the challenges we have in our world today, but also that opens it up so it doesn't feel so much more like a religion, but more as a cultural practice or a way of life, and then it's something that many more can embrace.
Okay, so here's the thing. Now, obviously, today we're going to be talking about Hinduism from a British lens. So let's say, here's the thing. Now, I have a particular mindset when it comes to what constitutes being a Hindu. Now, obviously, I'm not saying there will be no overlapping conditions or prerequisites when it comes to a British Hindu or an American Hindu, or let's say a Hindu born and raised in India. But if I was to ask you, because let's start with, we can always discuss the similarities and sing Kumbaya and dance around in the aisles, and it makes no sense.
I was looking forward to that.
No, but we will focus on the uniqueness of, so think about it. Now, as you said, when we started with the introduction, right, you mentioned you're also now associated with the Hindu American Foundation. So think about this. So now you are dealing with the Hindu American Foundation. Now, American Hindus have a unique experience. British Hindus have a unique experience, and Indian Hindus have a unique experience. Now, what would you say are things that you find different in terms of, because look, not only just knowing me or interacting with me, you meet so many Hindus from India, whether it's from the internet or when you travel to India or they travel to the UK. Now, what are the differentiating factors? I'm not saying this in a negative sense, just in the sense of, okay, these guys look at Hinduism differently, and for them, Hinduism is a completely different experience in this area. So have you observed something like that?
Sure. So a few points come to mind, and I don't think they're universal, but these are just points that I'll put out there, and I would love your rebuttal or your reflections from an Indian perspective as well. So the one thing that I've noticed more and more personally, and let me start with a caveat actually. So my experience of being Hindu, I would say, is quote unquote an enlightened or more progressive experience. I think I've got it quite good in what I experience as a British Hindu. Now, I've had some exposure to what different experiences are like here on these isles and of course globally, but I just want to caveat that. So when I talk from my perspective, like let's just understand where I'm coming from. So first thing that I would point out where I think there is a difference is our lifestyle choices. So how do we take the principles of being Hindu, the cultural principles, and embed them in our lives? So by that, I mean our words, our thoughts, and our actions, right? So things like being compassionate. If we're going to take ahimsa and really, internalize it, what does that look like? Well, it means that even the words I speak to another, am I thinking about the impact that they would have? My actions, so not just my actions for my family, but also the action, like the consequence of my actions to the environment, to animals, to society, so on and so forth. What does that look like? So, here in the UK, something that I've seen that I absolutely love is this move of embracing veganism. I think in the last 12 months, we've had such a spike in the growth of veganism here in the UK. Like I think it's up by 40% or so, right? Now, with NHSF, when I was visiting students, so many students, 4 years ago, they were not vegan, right? They would be vegetarian, maybe questioning vegetarianism. Now, I can go around the country, I can go to people's homes, and there's generally like a vegan option available when you're having jai. People are actively talking about why they're vegan. Some, go down the activist route, and some are just happy with practicing compassion on a personal basis. Now, that's extending from the personal and the individual into the mandirs, into that institutional, into that communal space of worship or meditation. And so pujas and artis and different practices are now being, completed or done with vegan milk, with soya milk, or with oat milk. And in other instances, the minimization of using cow's milk is in practice. Now, that for me is a good symbol, or it's a good sign of how Hindu Dharma is an evolution. You have a principle. It's not an absolute ruling. It's not this is the way things are. It's okay, if we take this principle, how do I apply it given these circumstances, given what the dairy industry is like here today? So that for me, I think is an example of Hindu Dharma in action in the UK. But do I see that mirrored across when I interact with Hindus from India? Not necessarily. Now, India is a really big place. I can't claim to have access to all of those experiences, but that's like one example. So lifestyle and, how we choose to practice and apply our principles. So veganism and what we do in mandirs, I guess, is like one snapshot of that. I think another is this notion of responsibility. So I'm totally going to quote Jiddu Krishnamurti here, right? If I have the ability to respond, I have the responsibility to do something. And so this notion of I need to keep developing myself as an individual, right? Not just my skills, which I'll get through my job, I'll get through, education, so on and so forth, but I'll also accumulate, clarity and a rootedness with a set of values. We can call that character, we can call that a set of values, whichever we prefer. But those two things will really constitute how I can respond to things in the world. And so this notion of internalizing and saying, okay, if this is how my story is portrayed, or if this is how, or this is what's happening under my roof or on my land or, in my country, how do I respond to it? What am I going to do about it? Mm-hmm. I think that's a growing notion that we're seeing here in the UK. There's a lot, I think also in the US, examples that we've seen. So you had this case at Oxford with Abhijit Sarkar speaking, in an inflammatory way towards the Hindu tradition. Now, I'll just use that as an example. My question would be, 10, 15, 20 years ago, would we have had young people mobilizing in the way, campaigning on campuses to say, this is not right, this does not represent me? So that ability to respond to say, my story will not be told by another, I will own my story, is, I think, a progressive journey that we're seeing here as well. And then I think extending onto that, and this is probably a bit more tenuous where I'd want your feedback, but this notion of externalizing, and I'll say this from where I came from. So, in Islam, if something bad happened, it would be God's will. If something bad happened, you'd have a victim mentality of, oh, poor me. Why does everything have to happen to me? Why can't I get a break in life for once? What have I done that's been so terrible? Now, that was 10 plus years ago for me. Whereas now it's, okay, these are my circumstances. How do I respond to them? And what can I control? I'll just focus on that. I think that's a really big difference of embracing a plural, progressive set of values versus something that, is a bit more rigid and dogmatic. Now, I don't necessarily always experience that difference when speaking to people internationally. That notion of, this is happening to me, I must have some accumulated some bad karma or something, and that's why it's happening to me. And so that notion I see as very different here in the UK versus what I've experienced of India.
So that's very interesting. So let's talk about this. Let's unpack this a little bit more. Now, obviously, the veganism bit I can understand, because you can't be a vegan in India. Everything is the dairy products. Paneer is all over India. so you can't escape.
I'll have to introduce you to my friend Tofu.
No, we've had our discussions offline about that. But this bit about karma and the cumulative effects. Now, so this is a technical question, right? This is a theological understanding of Hinduism, where, so what you're saying is that what you've experienced in the community in UK, there are different ways of theologically understanding Hinduism in comparison to how people would theologically understand Hinduism in India. Now, my question, my follow-up question to that would be, how much of the Anglo-Saxon value system or the Anglosphere's value, set of values have got to do with that? Is it, I am force-fitting my understanding of Hinduism on the basis of my external reality, or Hinduism has that flexibility? You see what I'm trying to say?
Kind of. So let me try to respond, and then you can tell me if I've gone off track. So something that stands out in this way is, if we look at British culture, if we look at English culture, there is a strong sense of individualism. Right? So you start with I, and then, your concern extends to others. Whereas if I think of what the Hindu expression that is building in the UK is actually, I will be looked after if I can care for others, if my base can be bigger than who I am. And so your starting point isn't the individual. Your starting point is always greater. It might start at the family. It might start at your street, it might start at your community, and then it will expand out into, my city, my county, my country. And so that notion of always expanding where I have the ability to respond, where should my concern be, and how do I respond to circumstances, not just for me as an individual, but as a wider impact, I think that's the differentiator to respond to what I think your question was.
That's fair enough, but again, see, so like I said, a lot of times what I have seen, so I'll give you another good example. So this has been my experience in academic circles in the West in general. So when you read philosophy schools or just academic papers in general, so this is the standard line given in the West. We, the West, are individualists. Asia and the Indians included are collectivist societies. Now, I have never kind of agreed with that. In fact, I'm going to be maybe writing about it someday, or maybe do a monologue on it, because my understanding is that India is not individualist in the sense of how maybe the West understands individualism to be, very crude, very, my way of, or the highway kind of individualism. But India is also not entirely collectivist either. So let's take moksha or nirvana, or the last journey for a Hindu. Obviously, for a Hindu who believes in certain prerequisite conditions like an Atman and a reincarnation, etc., etc. Obviously, for me, it doesn't apply, but that's fine. But I'm just talking about the the larger genre of Hindus here. By and large, most darshanas believe in that. Now, the point is that your journey, even for the Atman, is an individual journey. So in that sense, spiritually, Hinduism is very individualistic. Like, my karma or my journey is my individual journey. But in spite of that, we do have a sense of a collective. We do have society, we do have rules, we do have smritis, we do have all of that. So but if you look at it from the sense of a Western perspective, where you either have that Protestant ethic, fierce individualism, and it kind of extends to every aspect of your life, which in a way is the birth of Western secularism too. And although the Indian version of secularism is just bollocks, but that's for another day. But do you think a lot of that has played into it, and people tend to confuse Hinduism even at a theological level?
Okay. So I think there's a several points I want to respond in that.
Sure.
So let's do them one at a time. So your question is, are we looking at Hindu dharma through an Abrahamic lens, right? Absolutely. So I think there are lots of misconstructions, and like one of the things that I want to talk about is actually how we understand the Hindu view of women, and how we've interpreted that through an Abrahamic lens, said it's backwards, and actually maybe there's something else to look at there, and we'll come to that later on, I'm sure. So do I think it's being looked at through an Abrahamic lens? Absolutely. I think if we look at, even just this notion of Bhagavan, you've got 6-8 different qualities that come from the word bhaga, and yet here in common vernacular you reduce it to mean God. It doesn't mean God. At its simplest level, you could say it means enlightened being. The same thing with karma. There are parallels drawn into sin and reward from the Abrahamic theologies. This notion of heaven and hell, it's a state that you live in now. It's not some place you're going to go to from a Hindu view. So yes, I think that there has been an Abrahamization of the Hindu experience, and I think that's universal, like across the world. I don't think that's just limited to these isles. I think the second part to it is not just what exists in academia and academic circles at like at a degree level, but also what we experience within schools. So today in schools, the way Hindu dharma is taught, or Hinduism is taught in schools, it's there are 3 gods: generator, operator, destroyer. That's what God stands for. Nuclear weapons are justified because of the existence of astras in some of the texts, and the Hindus believe in the caste system. That's pretty much largely the messaging that's going out to people, and even then it's not studied en masse. But when it is taught, it's taught in that way, with images of India depicting what being Hindu must be like as an experience, and that leads to a whole other set of issues. But one thing that I wanted to, I guess, offer a slightly different lens to with what you've said, and I'll try and recall as much of that as I can, is that perhaps we look at things with this Abrahamic lens, and with it comes a masculine archetype. So if we look at the Abrahamic tradition, so I'm talking about Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, you don't have the presence really en masse of female deities, of the female divinity, so on and so forth. So how to interact and experience women in different ways, but also different ideas. The feminine is limited, And so you can't help but then look at things from a masculine perspective. And that leads to a bit more aggression. That leads to, my way or the highway. This is the right way. It leads to, I think, and I'd probably be stretching here, but supporting an exclusivist way of thinking rather than a plural way of thinking. To then circle back on that. Mm-hmm.
Oh no, so just to ask you a question about this particular statement, but this is sometimes where I have a difference of opinion. I'm not saying you do that, but I have seen this tendency in Western Hindus where they use Abrahamism. Abrahamism is very exclusivist, I do get it. But do you think Hindus in the West tend to get too relativistic in response to that?
Ooh. I think with the rise of postmodern ideas in the common spaces, it can happen. But I think that this is because Hindus here and more generally are a little bit confused, a little bit muddled on identity, and are finding their self-expression. So rather than it being a direct reaction, I think that there is, through the history, like Hindu Dharma, or like the Hindu civilization is the oldest living civilization we have in the world. And it's had its highs and its lows. And I would say 800 to 1,000 years, we've had a big blip, right? So trying to rise back out of that is not going to be a straight and easy trajectory. It's not going to be the most simple thing to do. And so Hindus, I think, in the world over are discovering their self-expression, politically, socially, culturally. It's going to take some time to dust off, all the mud that's there, and find a more elegant, articulate way to express who we are, but also with some diversity. So your notion of my atma, that you articulated of my atma and my karma, and then that having consequences for me as an individual atma, could be countered with a different view where actually maybe that doesn't necessarily matter, because all together we come into the same spiritual energy. So I can let go of this notion of my own, or my sukshma sharir, or what so on and so forth. And you have the ability to do that as a Hindu. You and I can differ in our opinions, but you and I will still see one another as Hindu, even though we might not have a common thread that binds us, that might bind the third Hindu that we meet on the street. So I think that's quite important to consider there too.
It is, but okay, this has been my experience. So I don't know how to put it, but I've had the unique experience of living in the West, living in India, getting married to a Westerner. So again, you have that constant Westerner's perspective with you all the time. And so let me draw this narrative for you. So when I used to live in Canada, my wife's experience was very different from mine. It is actually only after I got married to a Hindu from the West did I understand that Western Hindus and Hindus from India are actually different in many ways. Now, how are they different in many ways? So let's get down and dirty now. So caste, let's talk about it. Now, my wife would, and look, we've known each other for a while now, and this has been my experience with all of you guys too. And I'm just using my story with my wife as an example because I think it's always easier to explain things. So she would not understand what caste is. She would not. And in fact, till the extent where I would say, no, there is casteism in our society, and it stems scripturally and societally. In some cases, the scriptural claims that are made by certain people are wrong, but in many cases, they're absolutely spot on. And she would always say, but I've not experienced any caste in my life at all. Never in my life. I was raised in a society where I don't even know what my caste is. I was never told that. I was born in a society. I had Christian friends. I had Muslim friends. I had friends who were atheists. I never understand caste. And I would not get her. But eventually I did. But she also got me because when she moved to India, and then she saw casteism in real life. She saw it with her own two eyes. And then she said, oh, this is what you mean by casteism. Now, this is where I feel at times, and this is my view, that when you preach the caste question to Hindus in the West, while I'm sympathetic to claim number one, which was my wife's claim that Look, I've never experienced it. How can I answer about something that I've never experienced individually? It doesn't even come in my brain. But then where I disagree is it stems into areas where Hinduism has no caste. And then you get into moral relativism and all the booga booga. So now,
Yep.
where do you stand in this question? So if somebody was to come to you, because you spoke about the stereotype, and I know the caste cows and curry stereotype is very irritating, and we all want to fight that, whether I'm sitting in India or you're sitting in England. But the point is that while we can fight the caste cows and curry stereotype, we still don't throw the narrative that there is no such thing as discrimination, right? So how do we deal with that, or how do British Hindus deal with that?
Yeah. So I'm going to have to agree with your wife in the sense of I don't experience it. I've never experienced it in the 10 years that I've had the pleasure of interacting with the Hindu community. But I won't stop there. So I think that this is a non-negotiable. I don't think, we've seen the evolution of it in the UK with, it coming into legal vernacular and so on and so forth. And I think there's no necessary reason to justify it. I don't think we need to hark back to the past to talk about Jati Varna. I feel as though this is something that we just have to evolve out of. Lock, stock, barrel. It's done. What social purpose does it serve? And I think education and more education is the way forward. So in the UK, we've not got the experience of caste, and that's been in 1 or 2 generations that's removed. The only times you might hear of it is from those individuals who were born and brought up in India who live here in the UK, where it might come into conversation, right? So within 1 or 2 generations, it's been removed. And that for me is a sign or an indication, a compass of where I feel India would need to progress, socially evolve out of it, because we do need social fluidity, and we have parallels that we could draw with, what's happening in the world today with things like social media, where people get judged by posts that come up 10 years ago rather than who they are as an individual. And for me, to embrace Hindu Dharma fully is to understand that human beings evolve and they learn and they also change. So whereas you may have been a businessman before and now you've become a podcaster, that evolution is totally natural, and that's fine because you as a human being have evolved. And to be able to accept that, I think is really important. So for me, I think that there's no need to justify caste. There's no need to say it had a purpose. That if it did, fine, great. That day is gone. In the society that we live in today, we need social fluidity, we need social mobility, and we need to see people for their merits. Not necessarily the family that they were born into or what circumstance they were born into. What control do we have over that? So I think it needs to go, is my personal opinion.
So, somebody in the live chat has asked this brilliant question. So, and I think this would be a great follow-up. I would have maybe asked it later on, but I think I'll just go for it now. So it's a good question. How entrenched is caste among British Hindus with respect to marriage and intermingling? And follow-up, have you been asked your caste while engaging with the community or temple visits? It's a good question.
Okay. Second one, never.
Great.
So never been asked my caste. And in terms of marriage, I wouldn't even know where to begin, because it's not a conversation whereby I go and ask a friend, oh, what caste are you and what caste is your husband? So how do I really answer that question? It's not a common experience.
This right here is the fundamental difference between Hinduism outside India and Hinduism in India. It's reducing in India, Drishti, and believe me, it is. The more India gets urbanized, like in Mumbai, you will see casteism, but not that much. You have to go say 1 hour, 2 hours away from Mumbai, and you will see caste right in your face. Because still, you look at how still India is relatively endogamous even now. It's reduced significantly, but it still is. But this is the thing. Why did I ask you this question? Because what was this podcast about? Hinduism from a British lens. And the question is so alien to you, right? You could not process it. You were like, in Hindi, you're like, "Abhe, kya bol raha hai, bhai?" It's that expression, right? But it's very important. It's my job to ask this question and to bust this myth, which the world and experts who are non-Hindu of Hinduism who want to paint and they want to pummel Hindus outside India. And I have no other word to use other than pummel Hindus outside India with this caste stick, because something like that happens in India. So this is my follow-up question to you, Drishti, and this fits right into this force fitting of a homogenous Hinduism. And this is not done honestly by Hindus outside India or Hindus in India. This is done by a certain clique of individuals. We don't need to name them, but there is a certain clique. It's a global religion of progressivism that is superimposing a very homogenous Hinduism where everybody is the same. Now here's the thing, right? Something happens in the realm of I'm sorry, politics or social life in India, and this clique will come to you. Oh, Drishti, what do you think about this opinion? And I have never understood this, Drishti. It's like, imagine some Italian, used to be from Italy, but was born and raised in England. Now, whatever happens in Italian social life or Italian political life, nobody would dare ask this question to an Italian Brit. But for some reason, this honor is bestowed upon Indian Hindus or people of Indian origin, as if they have to answer for everything. Some village in India had a problem. Drishti, what do you think about this as a Hindu? How do you react to that?
So how do I react to those instances? It's interesting, right? Because I think if we take one step back, why does this happen and what is this experience? Like what's underpinning this experience? And the way I see it is that the Hindu civilization, the Hindu culture, the Hindu tradition is like the last bastion or the last largest bastion of pluralism. Whereas in the world over, you do not have pluralism, you've got exclusivism. And so when engaging in these conversations, you are having almost like a battle of frameworks of trying to interpret pluralism through the lens or the framework of, an individual way or Abrahamic or a exclusive way to look at the world where there is a moral authority on what is right and wrong. And therefore, and also extending into that Abrahamic view of the world, that there must be a defined point of right and wrong. So these traditions, if we're going to look at it from a religious perspective, will have a book, a scripture that is a moral authority. That's not the case in Hindu Dharma. So in school, when young people are asked, what's your book? What's your defining authority? Hindus don't have an answer. Just because it's force-fitted, you say, the Gita. It's not true, but that's a force fit because you're viewing Hindu Dharma from that lens. And then when you come to this example in the village, being able to answer, you're meant to be able to give this moral right and wrong, whereas we work from principles. And so, I don't feel the need to answer for it. I don't feel the need to be defensive all the time. And I absolutely agree. It is a special treat reserved for, Hindus outside of India and in India. And in terms of responding to it, I would want to be dismantling the framework. So what authority or why is this question coming to me? And why am I, in any way obligated to answer it? To justify it. I can say it's wrong and still be comfortable with my Hindu identity. I can say, oh, that's the right thing and this is why if I'm educated, but I'm not obligated. And so I'd want to dismantle what the driving force is for such questioning, but also introduce my own definitions in such an instance.
Yes, so I'll tell you how I have never understood this way. So I have done this. Again, I'm a little brash for normal people, but it was interesting that person did not realize that I'm from India. My accent should have been a giveaway, but they still did not get it. But they asked me this question and I asked them, so where are you from? And that person said, I'm from XYZ country. But to that person's bad luck, I follow politics of that country very well. And I started asking them questions about their country's politics. And I was like, once you answer each and every question about your country's politics, he's like, that's not my country. I'm American, man. I was like, well, then why are you asking me this question? Are you a racist American? And that's when they got it. Oh, I'm not supposed to ask this question. And it shows in a very weird way that acceptance that these are our people is still not seeped into the larger narrative. Or am I I'm overdoing it? I could be, and I'm open to that.
I don't know, because I feel quite comfortable personally with my British Hindu identity. Like, just before we started, I joked and said, oh God, I've got to be really British. I need to get my cup of tea before we get started. So is there a lack of appreciation or a lack of assimilation in that sense? For me, no. In terms of how I'm viewed by society and my experience of that. Again, I don't think that happens at an individual level from your interactions, but where you've got these narratives that swim around in media, I feel like that's a different ball game that we're playing there. Their ideas and narratives are being formed and put forward, and you've dismantled it quite elegantly in the example that you just gave. But every instance, the Hindu might have to go on the defense to say, how do I penetrate through this wall, or actually let me simply disengage. But that is where I think that point about responsibility that I mentioned right at the start of the speaking comes in, right? So who's going to tell my story? Now, for years and years, murtis have been described as idols, or for years and years, Bhagwan's been reduced to God. For years and years, karma has been misinterpreted, all of these things. But that's because somebody else has been telling my story as a Hindu. So what responsibility do I take to educate myself, but then also introduce a more authentic narrative? And I think we're at that crossroads where we're discovering how to articulate it and also penetrate through these frameworks where our story is being told for us. And I think we have a unique responsibility here, especially when we're looking to those powers that you alluded to, or those institutions that you alluded to, in educating the world about pluralism, about acceptance, and the need for, or our fluidity, in the sense of, I can be a British Hindu where I hold my values, those values of being rooted or connected to Bharatiya culture, to understanding values that I want to live my life by, living in harmony with dharma, but then also having a civic responsibility for my karma bhumi. And that's a unique assimilation of my Hindu values that come from ancient India and my British values where I live, where I've been born and I live today. And that's a unique identity from the American Hindu. That's a unique identity from an Indian Hindu. And so they are all different, and that expression will be different, but there'll be some similarities in terms of the Hindu values that manifest with the national identity that we're talking about.
Yeah, but then in a scenario like that, if let's say your British values clash with your Hindu values, has that ever happened in your experience, and how do you grapple with it then?
So I'm trying to think of an example, right? And for me, coming to applied dharma is probably like my ruling drive. So if I'm looking at what would be an example? So trying to think of an example here to bring it to life. I don't think I've experienced a clash where I've felt a dichotomy of myself. My Hindu values really do feel like they're in harmony. Like, if I want to be serving my country, serving my karma bhumi is natural. I couldn't think of an example, Kushal, where I've experienced a clash.
Well, that's good. So that's a positive development. Your Hindu values and British values are not clashing with each other, because I'll tell you where it happens. Now, we obviously have discussed caste, but in my opinion, I think sometimes, I think when certain theological problems in Hinduism do arise or crop in certain discussions, in my observation, I think Hindus outside India tend to struggle in giving robust replies, and that's when this tendency to cling on to moral relativism or post-colonialism, or oh, that is just the Abrahamic lens, that is just a Western construct, that is just this, that is just that happens. And I don't think so that stems from a place of intellectual honesty. That stems from a place of, that's just a cop out. That's like a, get out of jail card kind of a situation, where I just use this to avoid the scenario and avoid the questioning, which in many cases might be genuine. And I think somebody also has asked this question in that sense, that what if a section of society wants to hold on to the past ideas while another one wants to go into the new age of modernity? So, it's impossible that even inside the British Hindu sampradaya or community, it's not happening, right? There might be people who want to cling on to certain old ideas, and there might be young kids in the Hindu community that they want to upgrade their version of Hinduism and they want to go on. So in that case, how do British Hindus deal with that scenario? How would you deal with that then?
I don't necessarily see like a massive problem in that everyone's welcome to their self-expression, right? Just because you might be older and have a point of view doesn't mean I necessarily need to agree with you. And I think this is where some of the confusion does stem up, because you have so many expressions. You have this as a, you have going to the mandir regularly as an expression of being Hindu, and you have somebody who maybe, connects far more with nature and never goes into the mandir as an expression of being Hindu. Both are equally valid and both are equally okay. So I don't necessarily see an issue with that. Where there is a conflict with these two individuals expressing how they are Hindu, well, that's for their own, dialogue development and for them to manthan it out. And it's not a debate; it'd be a discussion. That would be you applying dharma to it, right? Which is actually, can I look to understand your point of view? Can you look to understand my point of view? And what are our own individual needs? Someone might need, a place where they can meditate, and they need a symbol that allows them to transcend their sense of self. Another might just need nature. Now, that's just a very simple example. So I don't necessarily think that there's an issue in having multiple views and multiple expressions. That for me is the very nature of being Hindu versus anything else, where you would hark back to, this is the way things are done. This is, the only way to do things. And if you don't, there are serious ramifications. Like, which Hindu do you hear of saying, if you don't do this way, you'll be killed? Or if you don't do this way, there'll be, you will no longer be considered a Hindu. I certainly don't hear that here.
That's interesting. Okay, another one. How do you deal with the misogyny? It is there at the textual level. As a student of religion, I know it exists. Again, somebody can come back to, I know the answer too, but I still have to deal with this, right? We're having a discussion. Now, somebody might come back, I reject all those verses. And the thing about Hinduism is you actually are allowed to reject them. That's just a weird scenario. Like in Islam, I know you come from that background and you're like, no, you take it all or you leave it and I will kill you. So it's a different scenario, but how do you, okay, so if I was to, in your exploration, it's not that you've not come across that, you have. So how did you deal with it, as a woman and as a Hindu?
Yeah, sure. So if we're going to take inspiration from text, like, I'm not about to go on and quote certain texts, because I think I'd look at it from a broad brush perspective. So take a step back and look at it as a whole. For me, it's simple. Hindu dharma is an evolution. It is continuously evolving. Things that were written 1,000 years ago may be relevant today. They may not be. And, going back to the answer you said, I have the ability to reject them. But I don't just reject them point blank. I can consider them, and I can look to see if they do have any validity in my expression or in my existence or in how I choose to live my life today. And I think, like, the one example that I'd like to call out for this one has been something I've recently been exploring, is menstruation. Right? So for years and years and years, you would have seen things like, in Hinduism, women aren't allowed to go to the mandir when they're on their period, or they're not allowed to come into certain parts of the house, or this is not allowed, or that is not allowed. There's lots and lots stuff that, will not be allowed. And we viewed that as sexist. We viewed that as seeing women as impure, and that's been the vernacular that I think I've been exposed to when reading things online, when interacting with Indians and Hindus alike, right? So fine, I will definitely reject the impure part. But as you read into some of these texts, and as you read into the view of menstrual health, there will be this notion of actually, when a woman is menstruating, she may need to rest, right? She may not want to, or she may not be able to do certain things, so she may need to rest. Okay, fine, so let's park that there. Today, where I work, in the last few weeks, we've just had workshops on menopause and menstruation at work. I can name, global conglomerates that have now in part started to introduce menstrual leave, so 1 day a month for women to take optionally when they need to rest when they're on their period. Now, that is a choice that women have to exercise, to be educated about their own health and to say, actually, today I feel crappy. I'm not able to work at my optimum. I'm going to choose today to rest. Now, if we can look at those ancient texts and if we can see what they're pointing to, but also start to see them from the point of view that they were written, maybe we might actually say, rather than rejecting things outright, is there some relevance? Is there something that I can apply in the world today? And if so, how? So, there's a whole arm of an Ayurvedic approach to menstruation. There's something that I could take inspiration from. Now, how will we as women and how will we as a society be able to really navigate this world without having to reject fully, without having to accept fully if it's not right? Well, the answer is education. I find that for too much, there are backward-looking practices enforced onto women, such as, there'll be mandirs in their constitution that will say, a woman on her period cannot enter, a woman cannot do X, Y, Z. And what I found and what I've experienced is it's often women that look to propagate those rules themselves. And so the way out of it for me is education. If we can start to educate ourselves more on what is our hormonal cycle, how are we different as women and men, right? So men operate on a 24-hour cycle. Women operate on a 28-day cycle typically. So the journey for us is different. We have to start with compassion, with knowing that journey is different. The spiritual gap is different in the sense of how we then actually go and approach, Hindu practices on a day-to-day basis. It might be different, it might not, but we have to educate women to be able to exercise the choice for themselves, is the point I'm getting to, rather than it being a rule that's written in a book somewhere, and that being the status quo.
Got it. All right. So I get it, but again, it's still, here's my problem. I think a lot of times now, while you have, I think, given perfectly reasonable answers, I think at a community level, sometimes, in my experience, I'm not talking about India again. India में तो मतलब कोई debate ही नहीं है, क्या हाल है पता है सबको. But I think there is sometimes the defense stems and gets into the range of apologia, if you know what I'm saying. That I'm bored of listening to everything is a Western construct, to be very honest. Like, if everything is a Western construct, even your argument is a Western construct, man. That's my whole thing. But okay, let's move forward from there. And now Hinduism, let's say, now forget India for a while. Now, something that I have again understood from my interaction of, so I've obviously I'm blessed, I guess. People will be like, hey, Cārvāka blessed bol raha hai, abhi bol diya, sorry. I've had the unique experience of interacting with North American Hindus and British Hindus. Now, in the case of British Hindus, what I have seen is that maybe because they've been in England for a much longer time, or maybe one or two generations more, their sense of security about their Hindu identity is distinctly more than, let's say, North American Hindus. I think North American Hindus still, I see more moral relativism in North American Hindus, if I was to be very honest, than British Hindus. British Hindus seem to be more comfortable, or have I kind of notice something wrong and I'm just hanging out with all relatives? Or is that your experience too, that maybe when you tend to stay for a longer time outside your native land, which is India, and then you're established there as a community, maybe then you get more competent and confident about your identity?
Right. So I've also experienced something similar, but I've not associated it with the length of time, spent in a land. I've associated it with our university education. So what I've seen, through the lens of my time at NHSF, the syllabus, the education, the rhetoric, the speakers that were allowed, the rise of cancel culture, so on and so forth, that started in America way before it started here in the UK. And so the ideas that we're exposed to, the experiences that we have in terms of what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, the policing, I think is fairly recent in the UK. And then that starts to creep into your experience as a Hindu. So I actually think we do see, a good degree of relativism and confusion in the UK. But I think we've had limited exposure in those memes and in those ideas when compared to the US. So that's what I've attributed it to.
All right, now let me start taking a bit of a few questions from the live audience. So let's start here. So a lot of questions are actually about the experience of British people. So it's very interesting. So somebody has asked, what change do you see in young Brits of Indian origin regarding the concept of Hinduism and practicing it? I guess what they're trying to ask is that, so let's say, so we have the generation that came from India. Obviously, they carried a certain aspect of Hinduism with them. But even within, let's say, the diaspora, the British diaspora, do you see, let's say, the parents' generation and the generation after that, and then their kids, has their understanding of Hinduism and even, so have the levels of practicing gone down or gone up? I mean, what is the trend there?
Okay. I'm not sure I necessarily follow that question, but what I could do is maybe just answer with, well, when you say practicing Hinduism, what are we pointing to? Are we talking about it?
Okay. So let's say, is the trend of meditation increased, or puja or archana increased, that kind of a thing? Are we seeing more Hindus in the West in terms of the younger generation visiting temples, or has the trend of visiting temples decreased? Is it decreasing or increasing? That kind of.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the expression is evolving. So in terms of engaging with what we would see as traditional in terms of arti, puja, visiting mandirs, I think, across the country, this need to engage young people, I think, is always there. And I don't think that's necessarily because young people don't want to engage, but I think that's at a local level. There's politics, there's all sorts of stuff. And, one of the issues that I think we experience in the UK just generally is nepotism. When I say generally, I mean to the Hindu Indian community. I think that's something there that needs to be cleansed out. And so that can, lead to a lack of engagement when it comes to young people who have ideas, are dynamic, want to move at a certain pace. But we are seeing an evolution where we would have seen more things from a community basis. There is a lot more practice on an individual basis, right? So meditation, yoga, being vegan, becoming a sustainability activist, or looking to reduce your consumption and your impact on the world. Those are all things that across the country we're seeing a rise in, particularly from the Hindu community. And that's because it is kind of natural. Compassion comes naturally. When you start to internalize these principles, it's not a big leap. It's not a big change. And even, for those who have been here a few generations, one thing that I've observed as well is even those that are disconnected from their Hindu identity in like a traditional sense of going to the mandir and doing puja, they may be, wealthy families, and their expression of Hindu dharma or Hindu-ness, whether they know it or not, is you have individuals who will only choose to invest in technology that is in the sustainability sector, or in the sector that promotes vegan food, so on and so forth. So there's multiple expressions, and I think the expression has evolved on this land as well.
Fair enough. All right. So, but so what I've noticed in North America. So I'll tell you why. So whenever I visit North America, I hear this. I hear the elder generations, um, which go on saying that they keep worrying about the amount of temple visiting kids reducing constantly. At least in North America, that's the trend, and they at least I see that worry amongst the Hindu community there. Is that the trend in England too?
So we're going through, I think, a bit of a transformation in the UK, right? So traditionally, mandirs have been a place for reflection, quiet reflection. They've been a place for ritual. They've been a place for maybe some life events, right? And I think we're going through a bit of a transformation where that question is being asked is that still the need of society? Because if you're going to measure people with different lifestyles, different needs, with what their parents, their grandparents' generations' needs were, which the mandir would fulfill, it's not going to work. Of course, you're going to see numbers go down. And I think with more and more young people coming forward, or people asking the question to say, actually, how do we make this a space that young people can use? We'll start to see that tip. So the questions that are being asked, such as, can this become like a sanskara kendra where young people can come to learn language? Can this be a space where actually we have, we've got land, we've got fields, or we've got a sports hall where we can come and play sports together, or we can play things like kho and kabaddi? Can we transform the use of a mandir to fit the needs of this, of the growing generation, rather than what it's traditionally been? And that evolution, I think, is what's starting to form in the UK. So we're in the midst of it. I don't think we're quite there. You will still hear people in the UK talking about declining numbers, but that change is coming.
All right. So how are the outreach programs to, let's say, people of other religion from the community in England? Let's say if somebody wants to, teach Hinduism to foreigners, are there young kids involved in those activities too?
When you say foreigners, you just mean people who live in England, right?
Yeah, it could be anyone, right? Let's say, so let's say there are young kids. So now there are church groups, right? Church groups have those young kids going out and teaching Christianity to other people. Now I know Hare Krishna does that, but is there something done outside the Hare Krishna movement, and where there are outreach groups where young kids are volunteering to teach Hinduism?
Yeah. So two things. So the first is the principle of needing to, spread or teach the tradition does not exist. Like, it is not my duty to make everyone Hindu in the world. Like, I'm not going to go to some special heaven to do that. So the emphasis is slightly different. I'm not here to proselytize. So that's like one fundamental difference that has to be factored in when we answer that question, right? So there's no need for that. I can be quite happy practicing what I do and then have a discussion with you. I don't need to make you like me. And I don't need to establish some kingdom of God. So that's one. Two, yes, there are opportunities for young people to share what they practice. So there's interfaith groups up and down across the country. There are interfaith groups that intersect for different causes, so like for climate action, so on and so forth. But also you have NHS, so the National Hindu Students Forum, that pair up with local schools. And so when there is an utsav, they will go in to say, well, this is the meaning of Diwali, this is the meaning of Holi. There are young people who are taking up the initiative at their local university to say, this is why I'm celebrating what I'm celebrating. And then, also sharing it with their cohort. So that level, yes, there is an engagement. I think the next evolution of that will be really the diversity and inclusion agenda is a growing space. Every university is appointing someone in this space, but to also educate them what it means to be Hindu. Because we've seen, certain levels of cultural appropriation on university campuses. That's probably the next step in what you've defined and described as outreach.
So, okay, somebody has asked, how do you explain to, say, a non-Hindu, whether it's a Christian or an atheist or a Muslim Brit, when they harp on caste every time they discuss religion with a Hindu? So how do you deal with that? It's very specific.
So I would want to know what their experience has been, first of all. So rather than having to be defensive, like, what is your experience of caste? Where has this idea come from you? And how many Hindus do you know that this is a relevant issue for? Like, literally give me numbers, give me facts, because it's not an experience I have. It's not an experience any of the students I've interacted with have. So what's your data? What's your source? Why is this an issue for you?
Mm-hmm. All right, got it. That's a fair enough scenario. Okay, let me see what else. This is I don't know. I don't know when Hindus will have to stop answering this. But does the average Britisher still believe that the Hindu swastika is the symbol of the Nazis?
Oh my goodness, no, resoundingly no.
No, so you don't have to deal with that anymore, because in America, I think it is a problem, right, for Hindu community there.
In America, but no, we've not had that issue, and that might be because there is a level of education at that primary school level where you have that exposure, but no, we've not experienced that here.
Interesting. But America, it is an issue in America. Which is very interesting. Okay, this is a very good question. I like it. Aag lagao. Is there a friction between first-generation immigrant Hindus and British-born Hindus with respect to progressive issues like female pundits, gay marriage, like the New York Times article recently mentioned?
I'm not familiar with the article, but in terms of answering the question, is there a friction? I think there's different worlds that sometimes communities can exist in. So, within across young people, do you see total assimilation between those that are first generation and those that are born here? No, not always. I think, your lifestyle, your practice, your worldviews are slightly different. So you can sometimes hang out in different circles. When it comes to the expression of opinions held, or even when that assimilation happens, I think there is a friction, but I think it's a healthy friction. Only if you have some friction are you going to find new views and argue things out and become either firm or unfirm in the opinion and the facts that you hold dear. So yes, I do think we see it playing out, but I don't think it's an overwhelming friction. So when it comes to, like, for example, things like gay marriage, I think we're quite comfortable with it. It's not as big as an issue as you might hope for it to be. It's very easily resolved and dissolved. And where young people or others are expecting like a really good course on it or something more, actually it's something that can be explained in a few minutes, where we're totally okay with all those different expressions of humanity.
All right, another good question. What are the behavioral dynamics between British Hindus, let's say, who've come from India, and British Hindus who've migrated from Sri Lanka? Do they engage? This is a good question. So I'll add a bit of a story. I think one of the best experiences of my life was meeting West Indian Hindus. If somebody had the award for the coolest Hindus on planet Earth, those brothers and sisters are the coolest Hindus on planet Earth. The best music, the best dances, everything is amazing about them. So how is it? It's an interesting question, right? Because the overwhelming domination of Hindus, even the Hindus who migrate, right, are usually Hindus who are from India. But there are Hindus from West Indies, there are Hindus from other parts of Africa, like Kenya. There are Hindus from Sri Lanka. So how is that experience? Or even Bangladeshi Hindus or Pakistani Hindus?
Yeah. Again, it's not necessarily something that I've seen as an overwhelming issue, just because when I was part of NSF, we had we had people from Sri Lanka, we had people from we had people from the Tamil community, we had people from Bengal. We had all this expression, and historically I think one of the issues that we've had maybe in some groups is a predominant North Indian concentration that's expanded out. And as it's expanded out, it hasn't just been limited to other parts of India, it's actually been the full spectrum. So we've had I think a process of learning where people can come together and say, actually what you're doing is just your expression of being Hindu, let me tell you about mine. And so we've been able to share that. I think that what you find at a grassroots level is that there are different communities of practice, there are different places of communities coming together. But is there a standoffish vibe between the two? No. Is there, the opportunity to assimilate? Absolutely. And I think with different utsavs and with different community events, we do see that mixing. It's not necessarily an issue where there is a predominant narrative. You have the ability to have both or more.
Good. All right. So this is another interesting question, very specific. Why did you choose to follow Hinduism instead of Buddhism? Did you explore Buddhism?
It's a good question. Why did I choose this? So for me, it's not necessarily the label that I'm attached to. It's exploring and understanding what feels true and what feels right and what makes sense to me. And what happened for me was finding something that is plural, something that is a culture that I can connect with, and that ultimately makes sense to me, that drove me here. So I did look at Buddhism, but when I was much younger, I'll caveat that. And for me, this idea of actually being able to explore beyond, to try and contemplate on what the Atma is, and having a worldview there, is what I found wasn't necessarily something that I found in Buddhism that was attractive. And the Ittihas, the culture, I'm Indian in background, it's a natural fit for me. So I also don't think it's a bit of an issue. Like, Buddhism for me is not something separate. To be Hindu is to be Buddhist in some way as well. It's not one or the other, which is why I'm struggling to answer this question. It's not something that's entirely separate in my worldview.
Good. And to that, new Ambedkarites in India will say, "Oh, you are annihilating our unique identity. How dare you, Drishti?"
That's a bit of an issue here in the UK as well, but not for the Buddhist community. I'd say it's really for our Sikh sisters and brothers, where we have a loss of identity, and that loss of identity stems from separating away from the Hindu culture. I have no qualms with seeing, the Sikh expression as another form of the Hindu expression. I see it as part of the same tradition. But where the Sikh community has separated away from the Hindu community, you see a loss of pluralism, you see an exclusive formation of moral judgment of what's right and wrong. And, in some instances, you're seeing that leading to a sense of militancy. But in other senses, and I've experienced this over the last 11, 12 years, we find that particularly our young women, but girls and boys are becoming more susceptible to converting to Christianity. And so I do think that's an issue here in the UK, but maybe just slightly with the Sikh sisters and brothers rather than the Buddhist community.
So what I've found something very interesting, and this is again my experience of living outside India. The Sikh community outside India is very different from the one in India. Like, I've said this many times on Sham Sharma's podcast also. Like, you have a conversation with the average Sikh in India, and you just have to utter two words: Canada, Gurdwara, and they'll just look at you in a horror. The Sikh, not me. They're like, "Oh, wo to pagal hai," kind of an expression. And the Pew poll recently is kind of a proof of that, where the sense of belongingness in the Sikh community and their attachment to India, their sense of patriotism, nationalism, their Indianness, their sense of commonality with Hindus is a heck of a lot different from the one outside India and outside India, whether it's England or America or Canada. But obviously, even in Canada, sent sympathies to the Khalistani. I don't know about any surveys in England, so I will not comment on that. Mm-hmm. But I know there have been serious surveys done on Khalistani attitudes amongst Canadian Sikh community, and it's around 10 to 15%. It hovers in that area. So I will not comment on the Sikh community in England. But I've heard, Punjabi lines like "Assi ta Diwali nahi manaunde ji," kind of a thing, which is very weird for me, because all my friends, Sikh friends in India, we've always celebrated Diwali and Vaisakhi and Guru Purab, all the festivals together. For us, these are all our festivals, right? We don't necessarily think of them as the other. So I do understand. I think it's a very good observation that you made there. All right, so Another good question here. Where do you see a greater amalgamation of various Hindu thoughts among Hindu community, North America or the United Kingdom?
Oh, wow. Where do I see a
It's a
greater
very good question. Excellent question.
I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that. Like, I find that there's so
That's
much
fine.
diversity in thought that, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily be qualified to answer that one. I don't think. I think the expression in the UK is beautiful. I have lots of different, wonderfully different discussions, but then I feel the same every time I engage with the US as well.
All right. This is another good question. So, is there any value in calling out the anti-paganism when confronted with caste, cows, and curry stereotypes? The word pagan in the West has bad connotations.
So, do we want to call out anti-pagan sentiments?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's the opportunity to reclaim the word. If it's something that has a negative connotation, which I agree with mildly, I think there is a process of education there in the sense of, do we want to use that word, or do we want to use something slightly different? I don't see anything wrong with the word personally, but I would say reclaim it and change the meaning associated with it. We see that activity here in the UK with things like ICCS, where Hindus and Ovates, bards, and druids come together and look at commonalities. So where is it that both traditions can support one another? For the Druid and pagan community, it's around organization and engaging the youth, because it is a very small community. And for the Hindu community, something that we lack is that affinity with nature en masse. And so both these communities are coming together and actually celebrating the commonality of being pagan, of not conforming to an Abrahamic notion. So I think there's an opportunity. I think there is the opportunity to call it out and reclaim the word. Yes.
All right. So here's a thought that I want to give to you. First, a little bit of my own thought, and then follow it up with a question. Now, this is now somebody might say, come on, Kushal, that's an absolutely ridiculous position to take, but I'm going to take it. My understanding of the Western discourse, the only good pagan is a dead pagan so that they can fetishize it. That's my understanding. In the West, I have noticed this, the Western fascination with certain pagan cultures, the Western left wing, the right wing hates pagans. They're very open about it. Their religion tells them to hate paganism, so it's very open. But the left tends to fetishize pagans, but they fetishize it because those pagans are like museum pieces, right? They are, a small population of 200 pagans there, a small population of a few pagans there, but that sense of awe, that museum piece thing is there. But in the case of Hindus don't get that privileges because Hindus are a large number. Hindus are now politically asserting themselves, and that's why they get a pushback. So have you, as a Hindu, noticed this, that while they fetishize the old school pagan of a certain background, that same privilege is not granted to the mothership of all paganism?
Sure. So on your first point, that fetishization, I can't claim to have experienced that. I see quite a lot of mockery of paganism in the UK, and at least in my experiences in terms of like the forums, etc., that I've engaged with at an individual level. I've seen that sort of sentiment. It's not something that's necessarily welcomed and with open arms. I think in Europe you probably have a slightly different approach where it's more of a living thing. It's something that's growing, and there's a growing pride in the pagan identity. And there I would say, yes, I experienced that dichotomy where being pagan is seen as a new expression, a new spiritual dimension, but then the mothership of spirituality, pluralism, and paganism is not met with the same accord. Yes.
All right. So last question, and then we can maybe wrap it up. Because we've had offline conversations about this, the one thing that frustrates me the most about, I don't know how to convince somebody in the West that tolerance is bad. They seem to think that tolerance is the most virtuous thing that one can have. I think tolerance is condescending. Tolerance is because when you have monopolistic memeplexes like Abrahamism, where there is no scope of like you've used the word plurality a lot of times in today's podcast. When there is a lack of plurality in the meme itself, all the meme can give you in return is tolerance. I've always tried to explain why mutual respect is better than tolerance, and it's almost as if I've hit a brick wall whenever I've had conversations with non-Hindus in the West. What has been your experience?
So I think it's a mixed experience, and I think the biggest issue I've come across has been within the Indian and Hindu community in actually understanding that principle. So that notion of we are all the same, we are all different paths to one truth, and missupposing the tolerance that they're receiving as acceptance, I think is the biggest issue I've experienced. So mistaking tolerance for acceptance, so the other way around. And when engaging, and so that changes the dynamic of engagement then, because you're providing acceptance and receiving tolerance in return. And I don't think that that consciousness or that awareness of this is the status quo is quite widespread. And that's what, where I think we lead to that moral relativism that you were talking about earlier, or that, identity relativism that we were talking about earlier. When it comes to engaging with the other communities, I think that it's not necessarily okay, because if you're looking at religious institutions, for a follower of a religious institution that is exclusive, for Christianity, for Islam, for the common Muslim, to be able to accept would nullify their religious belief. So how can there be acceptance when the very nature and the very practice that they have, when they're following an ideology, is to be exclusive? So until and unless the ideology changes, so Islam becomes a bit more plural, or Christianity becomes a bit more plural and can accept different expressions, that's not going to change. And with them being quite loud or pervasive voices here in the UK and abroad, we're not necessarily going to see that change creep into society either when engaging at that religious level. So that's one view.
So I think I've got a very good question, and we can end with this question. It's actually very relevant to our discussion today. Do you see the emergence of new panthas like you had? People don't realize that Hare Krishna as a movement, I'm not saying Chaitanya Mahaprabhu went there. Obviously, that movement is 400, 500, 600, 700, X number of years. But the point is that Srila Prabhupada went to America and he launched Hare Krishna from there. Do you see something like this happening in the future, where literally new panthas, new darshanas come out of, say, America, Canada, England, Africa, West Indies, where new Hindu darshans come out written by new scholars? Do you see any hope there?
Sure, why not? It's an evolving tradition, it's an evolving civilization. If we find new ways to marry science, reality, experience with Hindu principles, why shouldn't we create new languages, new frameworks, and new things, and new darshanas? I don't necessarily see there being an issue. I could see that crystallizing. So this evolution that we're seeing could crystallize into a new movement. And I think, what would be the test of time would be, are they linking into a tradition, or are they going to be standalone? Like, I think, if we speak of India, you probably have lots of self-styled gurus as well as some that are linked to a tradition. And that lineage, I would say, is something that's quite important to give it that longevity and sustainability.
I think there is a humongous possibility in the next 3 to 5 decades, some serious darshan, like a proper school of thought based on first principles, based on a new book, a new writer coming out of West and within the Hindu community. The probabilities of it happening from England are far more than the probabilities of it happening from North America, in my opinion, because wokeism is just engulfed North America right now, and I think they have to beat that that meme first, and then maybe they can think of it. England being a far more settled society, I think you can only have these kinds of innovations where you are settled and mentally at peace. I think America is just struggling as of now, but I'm really positive about it. So, all right, time to wrap it up, Drishti. So, before we end today's discussion, what would your final words be if you want to say something? And also, is there something you're working on that you would like to share with everyone?
Sure. So, I think, the British lens, I think, has been like the title that you've given this podcast, right? And how we assimilate our identities. And I think the one thing that will be true for any Hindu, no matter where they are in the world, will, come back to some principles, I think, that was mentioned in one of your other podcasts. So the one that you did on who is a Hindu, I think that's universal. And so, what are those principles? So that rootedness to the land, that appreciation of Bharatiya culture, an affinity and living in harmony with dharma and practicing pluralism. And, you asked the question earlier today of, has there been that conflict with British culture? And I said, no, I can't think of an example. And I think that would be an experience that is true for any Hindu living in any, any state, in any country, because there is a harmonious civilization where assimilation and expression, where being Hindu isn't meant to be a set of memes or ideas that is in conflict with your flourishing, with your growth, and that which will be sustainable for beyond you as well. It's not just for your lifetime, it's for the next and the one after that as well. And so any culture, I feel like, would assimilate with that, and you can bring that harmony there. And so I think there's, some real beauty in that expression of what it means to be a British Hindu, an American Hindu, so on and so forth. In terms of what I'm looking forward to, I think I'm looking forward to the narrative that I feel is emerging here in the UK of what a dharmic Britain looks like. So how do we start taking our ideas from a personal practice perspective and, really articulating, sharing them in the public sphere? So if I apply dharma to how the average Briton lives, what does that look like? Right? I mentioned we need an affinity with nature. We need to see, the demise of nepotism in the Hindu community and the Indian community in the UK. And, we need to build institutions. We need to start looking at things from a value and a principle basis. We need to start seeing, more of a confident expression of identity as we dust off this blip that we mentioned earlier. And I think as all of these things come together, we'll have a stronger, more confident, I don't even want to say it's a renaissance. It's probably what you were referring to in the last question. It's a new expression, and it's a new way of understanding what that British Hindu identity is through the lens of a dharmic Britain. So that's what I'm looking forward to, and that's what I'm excited about.
Perfect. I hope the journey is amazing. I hope we don't mess things up. That's my constant worry all the time. Maybe
hey, it's not an absolute process. Even if we do, we'll learn and we'll get on with it. That's the beauty of it.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think being true to our Hindu selves, I think the beauty of Hinduism or Sanatan Dharma or this land has always been the ability to handle differences and still live together somehow. Now we have a poll, finally, the Pew poll, to prove that. I always say that. Before, we just used to say these things and nobody would buy it. Now we have a poll, at least the one in India. We have one, finally. But this is the thing. And I hope today's podcast, the aim of today's discussion was that it's good to be different. It's fine to be different. Rajiv Malhotra used a beautiful word in his book, Being Different. He said difference anxiety. I think one of the fundamental differences between us and the West has been we don't suffer from difference anxiety. I think the West, at a fundamental level, suffers from difference anxiety. And when you suffer from difference anxiety, you tend to devour the person, not physically, intellectually, spiritually. And I think the greatest strength of this land and the ideas that have emanated out of this land and have gone all over the world is that lack of difference anxiety. And I hope today's discussion makes you understand It's fine to be British and Hindu. And they don't have to be like India. And we don't have to be like them either. And we can still be friends. So, Drishti, I wish you all the best. And thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
All right, guys, time to wrap today's discussion up. If you like the podcast, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment. You can troll me always. मैं comment नहीं पढ़ूंगा, वो अलग बात है. Please support the podcast by becoming a member on the YouTube or subscribe on Patreon. You can buy the Cārvāka podcast merch on kushalmehra.com or on kadakmerch.com. You can send your donations via UPI. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Tomorrow is, I think I'm going to do the MMA live stream after Sham's discussion. And then on Friday, I'm going to be having another podcast. Until then, namaste, take care, goodbye. See you next time.